Welcome to week 3 of the course. This week we will do two things. First, we'll begin to examine how Christians have used the secular theories we've been learning. Because, of course, Christians live in the world, and they use many of the same things that the world uses. Our task, however, is to learn to distinguish the world's things, the theories included, and discover when they're not going to be good for us. How do we make this determination? In several ways. One is by knowing and remembering what our purpose is. As Christians, we are ultimately seeking friendship and union with God. While this friendship will not be fully realized until the eschaton, the end of time, in this life we seek to give witness to God through our daily living. Another way to say this is that we are living out what it means to be Christian disciples. All of our life, every single part of it, is a journey toward God. Another way to understand what it means to do Christian ethics is to recognize that Christian ethics is Christian discipleship. In the very first week, I mentioned that a separate field called Christian ethics did not exist prior to the Enlightenment. Instead, Christians recognize that everything we do is ethics, because everything we do leads us toward following Christ or away from following Christ. With this in mind, then, we will begin to evaluate secular theories for what they helpfully contribute to our lives as Christian disciples, and for what they don't. This week, we'll examine a particular theory named Proportionalism, which was developed by Catholic moral theologians in the 1950s and 60s, and which borrows from consequentialism, the secular theory that we learned under the name utilitarianism. This discussion of proportionalism will lead us to think about virtue theory, which was a strong part of Christian theology and discipleship before the Enlightenment period. Virtue theory has been recovered in the past 3 decades as perhaps posing a way forward from some of the problems that secular theories have presented for Christians. I should note, however, that secular theories are not all bad or all good, in the same way that Christian theology does not totally give us a sense of who God is. In the rest of this lecture, I will focus largely on proportionalism, and then on John Paul II's reaction to proportionalism in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor. I will let Bill Madison introduce you to virtue theory, as he does quite admirably in this week's reading. This week's reading on proportionalism is complex, and so a thorough introduction is in order. Parts of this lecture are based on the book Introducing Christian Ethics by Sam Wells and Ben Quash. Proportionalism arises from consequentialism, or thinking about the consequences of actions. Proportionalism also makes use of Kantianism and, perhaps, relativism. The proponents of proportionalism use Thomas Aquinas' discussion of something called the principle of double effect. The principle of double effect presumes the reality that some actions, particularly those done in war or medicine, are likely to have some good and some negative effect. The principle of double effect presumes that there is a difference between doing largely a good action with a few negative side effects and doing an action that deliberately causes harm. When we use the principle of double effect to determine whether we're doing the first thing, an action that is mostly good, or the second, an action that deliberately causes harm, we consider 4 criteria. The action itself must be good, or at least neutral. A person's intention must be to bring about a good outcome. The good outcome must not be the direct outcome of a bad effect. For example, the end of suffering must not simply come through killing the patient. And finally, the good incurred must exceed the harm incurred. This principle is sometimes summed up by the phrase, the end justifies the means. A common application of this theory is in medicine, to permit physicians to prescribe powerful painkillers to patients near the end of life. The painkillers might end up damaging a patient's internal organs if used too long. But when life is short and death is near, the good of eliminating a patient's pain exceeds the harm to the organ. This is known as palliative care, and it is distinguished from euthanasia because the intention of the physician is to reduce pain and not end the patient's life. The physician never uses enough painkillers to deliberately kill the patient, only enough painkillers to keep pain at bay. Proportionalism extends the use of the principle of double effect to analyze the final outcome of acts in relation to human flourishing and the abundance of human life. The end that proportionalists seek is whether or not humans flourish, and so then they have to consider the means that would justify when humans flourish. Like utilitarians and other consequentialists, then, proportionalists evaluate action for their consequences. Will this act make humans flourish? It's a good question, except that by using this calculation, it seems that almost any action can be presumably justified if a person has reason enough. Proportionalism relies almost solely on an individual's capacity to make determinations about what is good or bad. It seems a person could just simply say, "It's good for me and my well-being, and so therefore it is good," regardless of what actions are taken. You can see, I hope, that from here it is a short step to relativism and its problem. But to be fair, proportionalists do not go quite as far as relativism. They do not solely rely on an individual's view of what is good. Proportionalists also borrow a bit from Kant's view that there are certain actions that we can presume are wrong because no rational person would see them as good to do. Proportionalists call the wrong that we assume no rational person could do as pre-moral evil. Pre-moral evil are actions that are destructive of who we are as human beings, no matter what end is sought. For example, a person breaking a promise is contributing to pre-moral evil. He or she destroys a bit of what it means to be human in the human community. So in the calculation of what would be an appropriate action to do, proportionalists always seek to minimize the number of pre-moral evil involved, in addition to calculating what the best consequences will be for achieving human flourishing. Pope John Paul II dismissed proportionalism as a good theory in his 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor, also known as the Splendor of Truth. The title of the encyclical is very clear about its focus: truth. In proportionalism, there is typically no one truth, because there are no actions that are considered what we call intrinsic evil. Intrinsic evil are always and everywhere bad. There is no end that would make that evil good. An additional problem for the Pope is that a focus on consequences means that a person might overlook other possible good actions or even better actions than the ones that are under consideration. And finally, of course, proportionalism ignores that the means of an action are as important as the end. How we get someplace is as important as the end that we achieve. In the same encyclical, John Paul II offers an alternative. He specifically mentions the need to cultivate virtue, see section 61, and he mentions the need to form our consciences. He writes, If man does evil, the just judgment of his conscience remains within him as a witness to the universal truth of the good, as well as to the malice of his particular choice. But the verdict of conscience remains in him also as a pledge of hope and mercy. While bearing witness to the evil he has done, it also reminds him of his need, and with the help of God's grace, to ask forgiveness, to do good, and to cultivate virtue constantly. The Pope maintains instead that people need to rightly form their consciences toward Jesus Christ. Conscience is not about what we want to do, but about living our lives for Christ. How many times does Paul mention in his letters that he is doing the thing he does not want to do, but he is doing it because he has joy in Christ? How then do we rightly form our consciences? How do we cultivate virtue? What are the means by which we Christians can cultivate virtues and form our consciences? These are the questions that will form the basis of forum discussion for this week. But we will also read about virtue theory in Bill Madison's book. Over the next few weeks, we will consider in more and more depth what it means to form conscience and cultivate virtue. I hope you have a great week, and as always, let me know if you have questions.